The train rattled along the tracks, carrying a long string of gray boxcars that smelled faintly of oil and mildew. Inside, the German prisoners of war sat in uneasy silence, the hum of the rails filling the void where conversation might have been. Outside the small barred windows, the American countryside rolled past in an endless blur of green fields, rivers glinting in the sun, and scattered towns whose neat streets seemed impossibly orderly to men who had spent the last years of war and chaos. They had been warned about the United States, briefed on its supposed decadence, inefficiency, and weakness, yet what they glimpsed from the train suggested a different reality, one that made some of them uncomfortable in ways they could not yet name. Carl, a tall, lean soldier with sharp features and perpetually tense shoulders, pressed his forehead against the cold metal wall and tried to imagine what lay ahead. He had heard rumors from the other prisoners, horrible tales of harsh camps and merciless overseers, but he saw no barbed wire in the distance, no soldiers with rifles lining the fields. For a man like him, trained to expect the worst, the first impressions were disorienting. He exchanged a glance with Dieter, a younger, more skeptical companion who simply shrugged, as if to say, "We'll see soon enough." When the train finally screeched to a halt, a group of American officers approached, their uniforms neat and spotless, their faces carefully neutral. The prisoners were herded off the train with an efficiency that made Carl's stomach twist with unease and grudging admiration. At first, the Americans' courtesy felt like mockery, but there was no hint of malice, only a precise adherence to procedure. Names were checked, papers examined, and then, without fanfare, the prisoners were loaded onto trucks that would take them to their new quarters. Even in this small stretch of time, the German men could not help but notice the contrast. No shouting, no abuse, only order and organization. The barracks where they were housed were modest, but far from austere. Wooden bunks lined the walls, the floors swept clean, and small windows allowed sunlight to spill across the rooms. Carl ran a hand over the rough wood, half expecting it to splinter, half expecting some hidden trap or sign of neglect. He found neither. The men unpacked their meager belongings under the watchful but non-threatening eyes of the guards. Some tried to make jokes, forced laughter that rang hollow against the backdrop of uncertainty. Others simply sat, staring at the walls, the sounds of distant machinery already reaching them from somewhere beyond the compound. Their first meals were served in a mess hall that smelled faintly of fried potatoes and coffee. The German prisoners, accustomed to rationed bland food, found the portions enormous, the variety bewildering. They stared at the trays of meat, vegetables, and bread, exchanging incredulous glances. "Is this real?" whispered one man. Another, braver perhaps, took a tentative bite and nodded slowly, as if confirming that yes, this was real. The food, along with the order and relative comfort, forced them to reconsider the tales they had been told about American cruelty and laziness. The cognitive dissonance gnawed at them quietly, a subtle shift in perception they were not yet ready to acknowledge openly. Outside the camp, the world seemed equally foreign. Small towns with neatly painted houses, streets lined with utility poles and flickering streetlights, and shops whose windows gleamed with displays of goods the Germans had only seen in pictures. Children played freely in the streets, their laughter cutting through the air like a bell, and farmers worked in the fields with machines far more advanced than any they had encountered in Europe. Carl watched a tractor plow a wide furrow across a field and felt a strange mixture of envy and respect. The scale and efficiency of the work, the apparent ease with which it was done, contradicted everything he had been taught about the ineffectiveness of American labor. Dieter, too, was observing closely, his critical mind beginning to weigh the differences against the prejudices they had carried with them across the Atlantic. At night, the barracks hummed with subdued conversation. Some prisoners spoke of home, of family and towns they might never see again. Others whispered theories about the Americans, questioning how a nation could maintain such order in the midst of war. Carl listened, his mind restless, imagining factories and railways, wondering what lay beyond the horizon. Despite the weariness in his bones and the uncertainty of the future, a spark of curiosity had been lit. He realized that no amount of propaganda or rumor could have prepared him for the reality he was now facing. The world outside the barracks, was orderly, industrious, and surprisingly calm, a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind in Europe. The next morning brought a new wave of revelation. The prisoners were transported to nearby towns and villages to witness the machinery of daily life in action. They saw mills spinning cotton into fabric, carpenters working with power tools that made precision easy, and delivery trucks gliding along paved streets with a smoothness that seemed almost unnatural. Everywhere they looked, there was a sense of movement and purpose, an energy that spoke of efficiency rather than desperation. Carl felt a stirring of respect, tinged with incredulity. He turned to Dieter, who simply shook his head, muttering, "This isn't the America they warned us about." The men were allowed brief interactions with local citizens, carefully supervised but real nonetheless. Shopkeepers offered smiles, curious children asked questions in hesitant German, and neighbors greeted one another with a warmth that seemed effortless. The prisoners began to notice nuances, the politeness that didn't feel forced, the casual but confident manner in which work was conducted, the abundance that suggested not only wealth but organization and planning. Carl scribbled notes in his mind, observations that conflicted with the simple narratives they had carried across the ocean. The discrepancy was both confusing and exhilarating. He found himself studying everything with a meticulous eye, trying to reconcile expectation with reality. By the end of the week, the prisoners had seen enough to feel their assumptions shaking. The Americans were not the disorganized, weak people their superiors had claimed. They were industrious, disciplined in their own ways, and surprisingly self-assured. Even among men who had endured years of hardship and indoctrination, whispers of doubt began to emerge. "Perhaps," one prisoner murmured during a quiet evening roll call, "we have been misled about this place." Carl did not respond immediately. He merely stared out of the window at the sunset over the fields, the golden light reflecting off distant silos and factory rooftops. The beauty and the order of it all pressed against the walls of his mind, challenging everything he thought. He knew, as night settled over the camp, the men lay in their bunks, the hum of the nearby town blending with the gentle rustle of leaves. Sleep was fitful, filled with dreams of factories, machines, and streets bustling with life. The cognitive friction between what they expected and what they had seen created a restless energy. Carl felt it too, a tension between fear, curiosity, and a reluctant admiration. The world outside, so vibrant and efficient, called to him in ways he could not yet articulate. The first impressions were powerful, undeniable, and profoundly disorienting. By the time dawn crept over the horizon, the men of the train had already begun to change little by little in ways that would shape the rest of their journey. The first time Carl saw the factory, he thought he had stumbled into some kind of mechanical cathedral. The building rose from the ground with walls of brick and glass, smoke drifting upward from towering chimneys that marked the skyline like monuments. The noise reached him before he stepped inside, an endless thrum of gears, whistles, and pounding hammers, layered into a symphony of work that never seemed to pause. As the prisoners approached under guard, many slowed their steps, instinctively humbled by the sheer scale of the structure. Dieter muttered a curse under his breath, his eyes wide. "This is impossible," he said softly, though Carl knew he meant it as an admission, not a denial. The guards led them through wide doors, and the prisoners entered a world that defied their imaginations. Inside, the air was thick with the heat of furnaces and the scent of oil, but it was not chaos. It was ordered, purposeful, like 1,000 parts of a machine moving in harmony. Conveyor belts carried steel sheets, sparks flew from welding stations, and overhead cranes shifted heavy loads with effortless grace. The sheer scale left Carl dizzy. He had seen factories in Germany, of course, factories pressed by shortages, bombings, and exhaustion. This was something else entirely. A world of abundance and precision, humming with a confidence that made him realize how far his homeland had fallen behind. The prisoners were put to work, supervised carefully but without cruelty. Their jobs were menial at first, sweeping floors, moving supplies, stacking crates, but it gave them time to observe. They saw women in uniforms working side by side with men, their movements swift and assured, their confidence unshaken by the presence of the prisoners. They saw young men too old for the battlefield, but not too old to keep machines running with practiced efficiency. Even older men, gray-haired and weary-looking, worked with a rhythm that spoke of discipline. The Germans had been told that Americans were soft, untrained, incapable of sacrifice. But what they saw were people who had adapted, who had filled every gap with determination. Carl watched a woman rivet steel plates with arms strong enough to outmatch many soldiers, and for the first time in years, he felt ashamed of the arrogance he had once carried. The scale of production became more staggering the longer they worked. Crates of parts rolled in one side of the building and emerged on the other as entire vehicles, trucks, jeeps, even aircraft components, completed with astonishing speed. Carl realized with a growing chill that this was only one factory in one town. How many more of these vast, humming places stretched across the country? The thought weighed heavily on him, pressing against the illusions of superiority he had been taught to believe. If Germany had underestimated this power, then the war had never truly been winnable. Dieter said little, but Carl could see the same recognition dawning in his companion's eyes. The prisoners began to take pride, in their quiet way, in contributing to this immense process, even if their roles were insignificant. They worked, longer than expected without complaint, partly to distract themselves, partly to study. Carl learned the rhythm of the machines, the way each station depended on the next, like a chain of interlocking gears. He realized that the efficiency did not come solely from technology, but from organization, from a system designed to eliminate waste and maximize output. This, he thought, was America's real weapon, not just bombs and soldiers, but an economy that could outproduce entire nations. He imagined row upon row of factories just like this one, each feeding the war effort like veins pumping blood into a living body. What struck them most was the abundance. Supplies never seemed to run short. Raw materials arrived daily, trains unloading with the precision of clockwork. Workers had gloves, masks, and tools in surplus, replacements always ready. The prisoners remembered shortages back home, ration cards, equipment patched and repatched until it failed. Here, everything was plentiful, as though the nation itself was an inexhaustible reservoir. Even the cafeteria in the factory astounded them. Workers lined up for steaming meals of meat, bread, and coffee, served quickly and without fuss. The Germans allowed their own portions, ate in silence, embarrassed by the contrast with the gnawing hunger they remembered from Europe. Conversations with American workers deepened the impression. At first, the locals treated the prisoners with wary curiosity, but over time, small exchanges slipped through the barrier of mistrust. A machinist once asked Carl about his hometown, comparing it with his own. Another worker explained how he had joined the factory when his son went to the front, determined to contribute in any way he could. These men and women spoke not with bitterness but with resolve, as though their sacrifices were part of a greater mission they believed in wholeheartedly. Carl listened with fascination, realizing that, for these people, war was not only about survival, but about defending something they valued deeply, a way of life, a belief in their collective strength. Some prisoners resisted the awe, clinging stubbornly to old beliefs. They muttered that it was all a show, that Americans were wasteful, that true discipline lay in scarcity. But the evidence contradicted them at every turn. Each day, the factories produced more, faster, better. Each day, the prisoners watched. Shipments leave the loading docks, trucks and trains carrying the fruits of American labor to destinations unknown. Each day, their doubts grew weaker, replaced by an uneasy admiration. Even those most determined to hate America could not help but feel the pull of respect. The longer they stayed, the more they noticed subtler details. The workers were not ruled by fear or punishment, as in Germany, but by a shared purpose that seemed to unite them. They joked with one another, sang songs over the roar of machinery, and left at the end of the day with pride in their faces. This freedom within discipline was perhaps the most confounding revelation. How could such informality produce such results? The Germans, raised on rigid hierarchy and obedience, struggled to comprehend it, yet the evidence was undeniable. The factories thrived not in spite of this freedom, but because of it. One evening, as Carl walked back to the barracks with the others, he stopped to watch the sunset over the horizon. The smokestacks of the factory cut dark silhouettes against the orange sky, their plumes blending with the clouds like brushstrokes on a vast canvas. He thought of his family back home, of the bombed-out towns and weary faces of neighbors scraping by. The contrast with this abundance, this relentless productivity, filled him with a heaviness that bordered on despair. He turned to Dieter, who stood silently beside him, and said, "If Germany had seen this before the war, we would never have believed we could win." Dieter said nothing for a long moment, then simply nodded. The weeks stretched into months, and the awe did not fade. If anything, it deepened. Every new machine, every completed shipment, every glimpse of another sprawling factory confirmed what they had come to suspect. America was not merely surviving the war, it was thriving. For the German prisoners, the discovery was both humbling and transformative. They had entered with mockery and disdain, but now they walked each day into the factory with eyes open wide, witnesses to a power they had once dismissed as illusion. The amazing world of factories was real, and it was reshaping them, one day at a time. By the time winter settled over the camp, the German prisoners had grown accustomed to the rhythm of factory life. The clanging of metal, the hiss of steam, and the steady hum of conveyor belts had become the soundtrack of their days. Yet beneath the surface of routine, something far greater was taking place, a transformation within their minds. What had begun as curiosity, as grudging respect for American efficiency, was evolving into deep reflection about everything they thought they knew about the world and themselves. Carl noticed the change most clearly in the conversations that filled the barracks each evening. Once the men had passed the hours speaking nostalgically of Germany, of their homes, their victories, and the inevitability of their country's triumph. Now, those conversations had shifted. They spoke of the factory machines, of the abundance of supplies, of the workers who laughed even while toiling for hours on end. They compared what they saw in America with the shortages, the bombings, the fatigue of life back home. The gap between the two realities was impossible to ignore, and though many tried to soften the truth, the silence that often followed their words betrayed what they were truly thinking. Perhaps their defeat had been inevitable from the start. Dieter, who had once been the most cynical of them all, surprised Carl one evening by confessing what was on his mind. "We were told America was soft, lazy, a country of comfort with no discipline," he said quietly, staring at the wooden ceiling above his bunk. "But these people, they work as if the whole nation depends on them. They have discipline, just not the kind we were taught to respect." His voice carried no bitterness, only bewilderment. Carl listened, recognizing in his friend's words the same realization that had haunted him for weeks. The transformation was not just about respect. For American factories, it was about rethinking the very nature of strength. In Germany, strength had always been defined by control, by rigid obedience, by sacrifice demanded rather than offered. Here, strength seemed to come from abundance, from cooperation, from a kind of freedom that still produced order. The workers were not forced to sing over the machines, yet they did. They were not commanded to share food with prisoners, yet sometimes they did that too. This voluntary spirit unsettled the prisoners because it challenged the belief that fear was the only path to discipline. One day, Carl found himself working alongside an older American named Samuel, who operated a machine press with the patience of a craftsman. The man's hands were scarred, his shoulders hunched, but his eyes were lively, and his words carried the weight of experience. "You boys didn't expect this, did you?" Samuel asked during a rare lull, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. Carl hesitated, unsure if it was safe to answer honestly, but the man's expression was not mocking. It was kind, almost fatherly. "We thought," Carl began, then faltered. "We were told America could not fight, that it was too weak." Samuel chuckled softly, not in arrogance, but in simple disbelief. "Weak? Son, we don't stop because someone tells us to. We stop when the job is done. That's all there is to it." That night, Carl lay awake replaying Samuel's words. He thought of his father, a man broken by years of war, who had always insisted that order could only be imposed through strictness and fear. Yet here was a society that seemed to thrive by offering its people the chance to work for something they believed in. Could it be that strength came not from fear, but from conviction? The question gnawed at him, reshaping his understanding of the world. The war outside the camp continued, but for the prisoners, time seemed to stand still. Letters from home were scarce, and when they came, they carried heavy news. Towns reduced to rubble, families scattered, shortages growing more desperate. The contrast with the abundance of American life was almost unbearable. Some prisoners wept quietly over their letters, ashamed to let others see their grief. Others grew silent, retreating into themselves, unwilling to admit how much they envied the very country they once mocked. Yet amid the sorrow, something new emerged, a sense of possibility. If such abundance and freedom could exist here, perhaps it could exist elsewhere too. The younger prisoners began to imagine what post-war Germany might look like if it could adopt some of the principles they were witnessing daily. They spoke of factories rebuilt not on rigid control, but on efficiency, on cooperation, on belief in shared prosperity. Carl listened to these conversations with cautious hope. Though he could not picture how his broken homeland might rise again, he knew that the seeds of change were being planted within them, even here behind barbed wire. As spring approached, the men were granted more supervised excursions into American towns. They walked past rows of tidy houses with gardens, saw markets brimming with goods, and heard music drifting from radios in open windows. The ordinariness of it all was perhaps the most extraordinary thing. For men who had lived through bombings and shortages, the idea of a life where families could laugh freely and never wonder if bread would be on the table seemed almost utopian. Carl felt a lump rise in his throat as he watched a group of children chase one another down a street, their laughter ringing in the air. He realized with sudden clarity that this was what they had truly been fighting for. Not conquest, not ideology, but the right to live lives of safety and abundance. By the time orders came for their transfer to another camp, the transformation was nearly complete. The men no longer spoke with contempt for their captors, nor did they cling blindly to the illusions of superiority they had carried across the Atlantic. Instead, they spoke with a mixture of humility and reluctant admiration, their voices tinged with the awareness that they had glimpsed a different kind of strength, one their homeland had failed to recognize. On their last evening at the factory, Carl lingered longer than usual, watching the machines continue their endless work. The clang of metal, the hiss of steam, the disciplined dance of workers moving in unison. It was a sight that had once filled him with shock, but now filled him with something akin to reverence. He turned to Dieter, who stood beside him, silent as always. "We came here prisoners," Carl said softly, "but we leave students, perhaps." Dieter gave a faint smile, a rare gesture from him, and for once did not argue. The trucks rumbled to life, carrying them away from the place that had undone so many of their assumptions. As the factory faded into the distance, Carl realized that though they were still bound by fences and guards, their minds were freer than they had been in years. They had seen America, not the caricature drawn by propaganda, but the living, breathing reality of its factories, its people, its strength. And in that vision, they had found not only the reason for their defeat, but also the faint outline of a different future. For the rest of his life, Carl would carry that memory. The sound of machines, the smell of oil and steel, the sight of ordinary men and women building extraordinary things. The amazing world of factories had changed him, not with force or cruelty, but with proof. Proof that strength could take many forms, and that sometimes the greatest power lay not in domination, but in creation.